Okay, now we can look at the control arm. And at the end of here's the control arm is a sort of a wishbone. Goes from here over to there, then down to the ball joint, which ties into the steering knuckle up above. And you can see, actually, from this angle, if you look at the bushing, the rubber bushing at the back right of the control arm, that the rubber bushing is just sort of disintegrated. And that accounts for that slop, I think, that you saw with the wheel moving back. And so we are going to replace it, and all we really have to do is we have to disconnect this bolt. Here's the second bolt, looking at it from the front of the car, behind the transmission. Third disconnect would be the stabilizer link. I'll show you that from the other side. And from down below it looks like this. And then finally we need to disconnect the ball joint, which can be disconnected either from this pinch bolt, the pinch bolt you see in the center of the screen, or you can disconnect these three bolts down here and disconnect the ball joint from the tracking control arm. So here's the tracking control arm. It goes from the ball joint and forms sort of a wishbone up to the front of the car, over to the back. And so in order to get this control arm out, you need to remove this bolt, which is towards the front of the car. Then over here, the second bolt towards the back. Then you have to remove the ball joint, and you have to remove the stabilizer link right here. So now you can see the link is free to move, and we will loosen the nut on the pinch bolt and then see if we can pry this end of the control arm down. Okay, so here we are taking the nut off the pinch bolt. So here's the other end of that pinch bolt that holds the end of the ball joint onto the steering knuckle. I forgot that the brake caliper is in the way. So in order to remove that bolt, we're going to have to get the caliper out of the way, which means we're going to have to remove this bolt right here, and then the bolt right up above it, and then that bolt there, in order to get the caliper off. And then we'll have room. Then we'll have room to remove this bolt. Okay, so we're going to remove the lower caliper bolt. So now we've got the caliper off, and we'll suspend it. I'm going to suspend it with a wire up to the spring so that it never falls down, and we don't want the weight of the caliper hanging from the brake line, which is right here. And you can see that the pinch bolt is now really accessible. There it is, and we should be able to get it out and then get the ball joint down. Just for purposes of being able to see this a little more clearly, I'll remove the rotor. 17mm bolt, so we'll see if we can back it out. Okay, so we got it loose, and finally, there it is. Okay, it's impossible to get the bolt. Occasionally it's helpful to put a large screwdriver or something into that seam that you see in the center of the view here. So if you can get a screwdriver in like this and just pry a little bit, or use a hammer and separate this, that can be pretty helpful in getting this thing off. Okay, and you see I've got a chisel between the control arm between the ball joint and the steering knuckle, and I've got it wedged right under that spot where the pinch bolt connects. So you can see almost the entire top of the ball joint here. I was getting tired of sort of struggling with this, so I undid the 3 bolts that hold the ball joint onto the tracking control arm. Those bolts look like this, and they go under here, as you can see, and that helped sort of, I think, free up the angle of the ball joint so it was easier to get it out. Okay, and there it is. That's completely out, and that's what it looks like. And you can see the groove at the top of the ball joint shaft where the pinch bolt goes through and engages, which is why you have to get the pinch bolt out before the ball joint's going to come out. Okay, so the final bolt of the control arm is right next to the pan for the automatic transmission. So I was going to possibly take the pan off, but I think a better solution might be to remove the bolt from the transmission mount. Then I think I'll be able to jack the transmission up out of the way and get the bolt out. So that's what we're going to try to do. I've got pretty long extension here, as you can see, going right down to the top of the transmission mount. Okay, so that's where it is. That's the top of the engine mount. And it's a 17 millimeter bolt, and I'm going to remove that. And I think that will allow me quite a bit of leeway to jack up the transmission. And okay, and you can see there's the top of the transmission mount right there, and we're going to remove that bolt. Okay, so here's how I finally got access to the bolt on the front of the control arm. I removed the transmission pan, and here you can see the transmission filter, and I had removed the transmission mount bolt from up above, and now I have, you can see in the back there, I've got a jack, and I've jacked up the transmission a bit, and now we have enough clearance. Now from this angle, from right underneath the transmission filter, you can see we have direct access to that front bolt on the control arm. So now we should be able to remove that and remove the control arm. And the benefit is at the same time we can change the transmission fluid. Okay, so here in my final moment of victory, you can see I'm removing this last bolt from the control arm, and you can see just how close it comes to the transmission filter. And of course, if you remove that filter, you'd have just, a little bit more space to get by. But as it is, that was adequate. Now, I should be able to just sort of wiggle the control arm out of its spot. Try to make sure that stabilizer link is all the way out. So here's the stabilizer link right here, up and out of the way. So I'm just okay, so I'm just going to wiggle this thing back and forth. So finally, after a lot of prying, you can see this messed up end, and I was able to pull it out like this from its little housing in there. Notice I also used another jack to just pry up on the edge of this disconnected stabilizer bar, and it was able to help me swing the control arm back and forth and not bump into that. You can see this is the shape that this particular bushing was in, so that accounts for all that movement of the wheel that you saw at the beginning of the video. And this bushing on this side doesn't look bad at all, so all the action was from this one right here. And here's my new control arm, complete with ball joint from AutoZone for a cost of $53, I think. So the price was great. And then we'll just install this and get the job done. Okay, so one more unexpected job that I'm having to do is to remove the strut bolts from the steering knuckle, because in order to get that control arm in, you really have to put it almost, horizontal. And so I'm going to try to separate this so I can move this whole assembly up and then have more room underneath to slide the new control arm in. Okay, so now you can see I've got the wheel, I've got the steering knuckle held by a heavy wire up to the springs, and that lifted this whole assembly high enough that I was able to put the control arm, you can see here's the new control arm, I was able to put it basically horizontally straight in, which is what you need to be able to do. You can see I've got one end of the control arm tucked in there. I've got the other end of the control arm tucked in there where it belongs. The only problem is that in order to do this whole thing, I've got the stabilizer bar, and I took that little rubber grommet off. I've got the stabilizer bar underneath the control arm, and it needs to be on top of the control arm. So what I'm hoping I can do is just push this whole assembly far enough up, then use this jack to jack up this stabilizer bar, and hopefully it will pivot to the right, and that will get it past the control arm. Okay, it actually worked. I pushed the control arm way up, moved all this stuff off to the side. I even had to push the bottom of the strut over. So I moved this whole thing, got it up out of the way as much as I could, pushed the control arm way up, and then I was able to jack the stabilizer arm up, and I actually used just like a screwdriver and pried it around the bottom, and now it's back up where it belongs above the control arm. So I think I can let this control arm down now, and everything's ready to be bolted up. See, we've got that end of the control arm in, that end of the control arm in, if you can see it, yep. We can let this whole assembly down and reconnect the ball joint. So now I'm just going to bolt everything up and put it back together.